I'm Rebecca King Ferraro.
And I'm Michael Sean Breeden, and you're listening to Conversations on Dance. On today's episode of Conversations on Dance, we are joined by documentary filmmaker Jennifer Lin. Jennifer's latest film, 10 Times Better, explores the life and legacy of dancer George Lee, who originated the role of T in George Balanchine's The Nutcracker. She tells us the inspiring story of George's experience as an immigrant, performing as a child in nightclubs and shuffling across countries before ultimately landing in New York City, and his experience working with theater luminaries like Balanchine and Gene Kelly. If you're in the New York City area, check out the Works in Process event on Wednesday, February 7th at the New York Public Library for Performing Arts, featuring a discussion about the film with both Jennifer Lin and George Lee. And be sure to catch the premiere of 10 Times Better on February 10th at the Dancing on Camera Festival in Lincoln Center. Jennifer, thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. We are so excited to talk to you about your film, 10 Times Better, which Rebecca and I both had the privilege of watching just yesterday. And I can't tell you how moving and beautiful it was. And we're so excited to share with our listeners. But since we haven't ever had you on, we always like to get a little bit of background about our guests for their first time. So we'd love to hear a bit about your own journey into documentary filmmaking, and if and where and when that has intersected with dance prior to this film.
Yes. Well, Michael, thank you for having me on the show, and Rebecca, you too. So my background is actually in journalism. I was a newspaper reporter for the Philadelphia Inquirer for 31 years and worked all over the world for them. And I got into documentary filmmaking about 10 years ago. I decided to leave daily journalism to try my hand at other types of filmmaking. And my first documentary was actually about the Philadelphia Orchestra and their legacy in China. It's called Beethoven in Beijing. And we were on Great Performances in 2021. And the current project really grew out of my interest in ballet. I grew up in Philadelphia. My mother was a ballet snob. Only the New York City Ballet would be good enough. So we used to go up to New York all the time to see the New York City Ballet and to see the Nutcracker. And my daughter, though, Corey Steig, who's one of the producers of the film, she was a real bunhead growing up.
Yeah.
So I was one of those dance moms. I was the dance mom on stage right who was doing the quick changes and, changing the scenery, handing props, cleaning up snow after the snow dance. So,
Yes.
I spent 10 years working on stage right at the Nutcracker in her performances. So this documentary really grew out of my interest in ballet. And I should credit my daughter for leading me there.
Oh, I love that so much. Can you tell us about some of your other documentaries? Have you done any other ones related to dance?
Yeah. So after I finished Beethoven in Beijing, which was, it came out on TV in 2021, I was fishing around for another project. And Corey, my daughter, actually gave me a copy of Phil Chan's book, Final Bell for Yellowface. And it was in the summer of 2020 that she gave me the book, and it really struck a chord with me. My father's Chinese, and so I felt like Phil really articulated something that I had felt all along about ballet. For people who aren't familiar with Phil's work, he and Georgina Paskogan, who's a former soloist for the New York City Ballet, they really launched the Final Bell for Yellowface movement a few years ago to take a look at the ballet canon and to see how we might, address some of the racial tropes that are in ballet. So they did amazing work. And so I was really deep into that documentary project when I stumbled literally upon the George Lee tale.
Oh, interesting.
So, I mean, I was doing research on the Nutcracker at the New York Public Library's Jerome Robbins division, the dance division, which, if you haven't been there, is just a marvelous place to spend a few hours. And so
we know all about it.
Yeah, we love it there.
I actually remember the date. It was November 29th of 2022. My daughter Corey and I were going to see the Nutcracker because Georgina Paskogan was doing Dewdrop. And
Yeah.
I had a few hours to kill. So I thought, you know what, I'll go to the library. Phil Chan's always talked about what great archives they have. So I was looking into the history of the Nutcracker. I was looking at like the San Francisco Ballet's files, and then they gave me the New York City Ballet's files on the 1954 premiere. And so I'm looking at it, and I came across photos, publicity photos, including ones of this young Chinese dancer in tea. And I was like, well, that's interesting. His name was George Lee. And I thought, well, if he was good enough for Balanchine to premiere and originate the role of T in the Nutcracker in 1954, he must have joined the New York City Ballet.
That's
But he
exactly
never,
what I was thinking when I was watching it
yeah.
too. I was like, wonderful. And then what did he do next?
So he never danced again for the New York City Ballet. And
Wow.
I was left wondering, like, what happened to George Lee? So that was November of 2022. I'm a newspaper reporter. I love challenges like this. I did quite a bit of investigative reporting when I was at the Philadelphia Inquirer. So I just like literally became obsessed with what happened to this dancer. And
Mhm.
I couldn't find really any trace of him. I found a couple little hints, like he seemed to do a lot with Andrei Glevsky, the great principal dancer. And I found a few newspaper clips about that, but I really, I just needed to find out what happened to George Lee. So
Mhm.
it took me 6 weeks, but I eventually found him. Um, I collaborated with another person, Arlene Yu. Arlene used to be the collection manager at the Jerome Robbins division of the dance collection. And so Phil Chan, Arlene, and I were kind of like on these parallel quests to find out what happened to George Lee. So I was like, using all my newspaper skills, opening my reporter's toolbox and like trying to find George Lee, but it's such a common name. And
Mm.
so I kind of hit, a roadblock. And then Phil said, well, you should try talking to Arlene Yu. So I emailed Arlene on December 22nd. And I said, Arlene, I'm trying to find this guy, George Lee. She said, I've been trying to find him for years too. What happened to him? So she gave me
Wow.
all of her research, and she gave me a clue that unlocked the mystery. Arlene gave me a one sentence brief from Variety newspaper from 1959 that simply said, George Lee became a naturalized citizen today. And when she gave me that clue, it's like, aha, so he was an immigrant. So then I went back to these databases that I was using. Ancestry.com, by the way, I'd like to put in an ad for them. It's a marvelous resource. I mean,
Wow.
it is absolutely incredible. So once I had that bit of information that Arlene gave me that he was naturalized, I then found on Ancestry.com his naturalization paper.
Hmm.
And what that gave me was his date of birth. And another important clue, which is he changed his name from L.I. to L.E.E. So with that, I did another deep dive into the database, and I found the ship manifest. So when you come over to the United States on a ship from anywhere, there are these manifests, and they're all public domain, and they're all on Ancestry.com. So
Wow.
I actually found the ship manifest when George Lee and his mother, Stanislava Lee, came to the United States in 1951. So this is how a reporter's mind works. So I had the mother's name, and I went back to one of my databases, in this case, newspapers.com, and I found her obituary, which ran in the Asbury Park Press. She died in 1981. It said Stanislava Lee is survived by one son, George, who lives in Las Vegas. So then it's like, aha.
Ah,
So I have like,
ah.
We're a town now, a city.
so this is a long answer to your question, but I had
It's
his
No, it's
fascinating.
fascinating.
I
Yeah.
had his date of birth, where he lived, and the correct spelling of his last name. So with that, I came up with 5 phone numbers. I called the first four, and I got the recording like, this number is no longer in service. I called the last one and I got a voice message like, please leave a message. I left this rambling message like, George, this is Jennifer Lin. I'm a filmmaker in Philadelphia. I've been looking for you for weeks and blah, 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 blah. And you were in George Balanchine's premiere of The Nutcracker. You did the tea divertissement and blah, 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 blah. And it just rambled on and on. Then I got a phone call back from George Lee. He said, this is George Lee. I said, oh my God, I've been looking for you for weeks. He said, why are you looking for me? He said, I'm nobody. And by the way, that was December 29th that I found him and he called me back. And honestly, when he told me his story, it was one of the most compelling tales that I've ever heard. And I've been a reporter for a long time. You know, I've interviewed a lot of people, I've told a lot of stories, and I have to say that the story of George Lee is one of the most compelling stories I've ever had the honor to tell. So when he told me not only why he didn't get hired by the New York City Ballet, he was too short, but when he told me about his life's journey, I knew immediately that this was a story that had to be told because it's a story of an immigrant, it's a story of perseverance, and it's a story of the love of ballet. So George is he's a pioneer, and I had to convince him of that. He's there like, why are you interested in me? And and I said, George, you were a pioneer, and you were one of the first Asian dancers in ballet. So that was December 29th that we spoke, and I was there with the crew on February the 14th. And here we are, like 10 months later, and we're really ready to share with the world George's story.
It's such a
Incredible.
special, cool story. What I imagine now that I've seen the film, I you could not have expected what his life would be. It's great to track down this person. This like, there was an actual Chinese dancer who maybe was in New York City Ballet. And oh wait, they're not. But then he still originated this role. And where did he go? Like that's inherently interesting.
Yes,
But then the twists and turns of George's life that
yes,
you navigate in the film are just wild to me. And I also love that the way that he is saying, "Are you sure you want to tell a story about me?"
yeah,
Now I feel like I know him after seeing the movie, and I can just so picture him being that way. The way that he kind of like unspools his life story, he's so humble and um calm and straightforward, and sometimes it to like an almost devastating effect. He'll talk about when the tragic moments of his life happens, and he just says something really calm and simple and straightforward, and it really packs a punch.
he's such a charming individual, and he's so humble. And the thing that really struck me about George is he comes across as such a content person.
Hmm.
He doesn't seem bitter at all. And he could have easily become bitter. Like, why didn't I get hired? Why didn't things work out for me the way I wanted them to? I mean, his dream and his mother's dream, his mother looms large in his life because she was a ballerina,
Right.
but he wanted to be a classical dancer, a ballet dancer. But for reasons that we explain in the film, that didn't turn out the way he wanted it to. But I'm so glad you picked up on that, Michael, because the first time he told me his life story, it was like, oh my God, this is like amazing. And I have a real interest in China, partly because I am part Chinese, but also I lived in China for 4 years. I was a foreign correspondent there, and Shanghai was the first city that I ever visited in 1979 with my father. And for the benefit of your listeners, I mean, George's tale is amazing because he was born in Hong Kong. His mother was a Polish ballerina. His father was a Chinese acrobat. And in 1941, they moved to Shanghai because, it was during the war years and Japan had occupied Hong Kong. So the family left for Shanghai. And the father was off in Western China working and was, killed actually in 1945. So George and his mother really relied on George's dancing as a child to
Hmm.
survive. So he danced in nightclubs in Shanghai in the 1940s, doing like little vaudeville type song and dance numbers. And sometimes they paid him in rice.
That
And
was devastating.
he told the story about, his mother would wait until he ate before she would eat. I mean, these were
Hmm.
really difficult times in Shanghai. But the thing I learned so much from George because I was interested in his background growing up studying ballet in Shanghai in the 1940s. I got a crash course in like ballet in China in the
Hmm.
40s. And what made Shanghai such a perfect place for him to land actually was because there were so many Russians who lived in Shanghai. Shanghai in the 1940s had like 25,000 Russians. A lot of them had fled Russia, after the revolution. Shanghai was one of these remarkable cities that had no visa requirements. So you had a lot of people who fled Russia and Eastern Europe in the 1940s. So wherever there are Russians, there's ballet,
Right.
right? And there were
Yeah.
some excellent ballet teachers for George. His mother made him take class with adults. So he was dancing with Russian adults. One of his teachers was a man by the name of Sokolsky, who was, a very big, well-known Russian dancer. He was with the Mariinsky Ballet at one point, in his youth. He danced for two women, George, Audrey King and Doris Yanover, who used to be with the Ballet Russe. So he had
Hmm.
excellent training in Shanghai. And then, just to summarize his incredible epic journey, in 1949, China was, there was a civil war and the communists won, and George and his mother were basically stateless. They had nowhere to go.
Hmm.
And so they were relocated to a refugee camp in the Philippines with other Eastern Europeans. So for 2 years, George lived in a jungle refugee camp, not dancing at all. He said it was too hot. So
Hmm.
1951, though, he got resettled in New York City. His father had a friend from his China days. This man was, in the U.S. military, but he knew something about ballet. His name was Davy Lerner. And so Davy told George and his mother that George needed to audition for the School of American Ballet. That's 1951. And he gets a full scholarship and catches the eye of Balanchine. And 3 years after landing in this country as a high school 18-year-old refugee from Shanghai, George is in the premiere of The Nutcracker to great acclaim, also, I might add.
Yeah. I mean, the story is just so amazing in so many ways. And I wondered, when we're talking about him being at the School of American Ballet when he premiered this, did you have any idea that, like, I had no idea that a student from the School of American Ballet originated Chinese, and hearing him talk about the process with Balanchine was so fascinating too.
Wasn't it? I mean,
It's really him, it sounds like the
yeah,
choreography that so many people do around the world, like it's him.
I didn't know any of that backstory, Rebecca.
Mhm.
But the clips that I found at the New York Public Library, reviews of the Nutcracker, they mentioned George.
Really?
He got a lot of acknowledgement in reviews for his tea divertissement. And in fact, at the Public Library, I also found an oral history by Richard Thomas, the soloist who took over the role for George. And in this
Hmm.
oral history, Richard says, no one could do the choreography that Balanchine made for George. He was wonderful. And Richard said, and no one was better than me, and I couldn't do it.
I
And
love
the
that.
I love that.
interviewer said, well, did you try? He said, I tried. I almost broke my neck. But what I found so fascinating, Rebecca, is that the creative process. I mean, George said that George Balanchine, came into the studio, picked him to be, in the Chinese dance, and asked George, "What can you do, George?" And George showed him, well, I can do this, I can do that, you know. And Balanchine said, I like that. We're going to use that. So he said it took him 15 minutes to choreograph the tea diver. And so I found that so interesting that, you know, Balanchine wanted to know, you know, what he could do and listen to him and incorporate it then, you know, what George was strong at into the choreography.
One of the most iconic
Yeah.
parts of that divertissement is the split jumps at the end, but you have a
Yeah.
picture of George doing it right behind your head there, and you show it within the documentary as well. I wonder, and this was something I was wondering while I was watching, his dad was an acrobat. Do we know if there's like, if he played with his dad and did some of that stuff? I know he died when George was young, but I wonder if we
Yes.
have any information about that.
Yes, George said when he was growing up in Hong Kong, so he was born 1935. So when he was just a little boy, his mother and his father were already training him. And his father used to make him do a handstand and then would walk away. And George had to hold the handstand until he came back.
Oh, until he
Yeah.
came back? Oh my goodness.
Yeah. So
Wow.
you know, unfortunately, there's no video of George performing, you know, the tea dance. So I don't know the choreography that he did, but I have to imagine that his father, you know, his athleticism stems from maybe his father and his father's training. So maybe in the genes.
Yeah,
Yeah.
certainly. Yeah.
There, even though there's no video of the tea divertissement, there is fabulous video of
Yes.
George in the documentary, and you see what makes sense why that tea divertissement looks the way it does, because George just had this incredible plie, the most beautiful jump, easy turns.
Double
Yes.
tour.
Um,
I mean, double
Yeah.
the,
tour
the
after
double
double
tour
tour.
that
Yeah.
lands in a plie that's like a grand plie.
Yes.
It's really, it's so beautiful.
Mhm.
Yeah. In fact, Michael, I was going to ask you to critique his dancing for me because, you know, I'm not a professional, but to me, it seems pretty awesome.
Yeah, he's fabulous. And then the video is it on the Ed Sullivan Show?
Yeah. So we have two pieces of video in the film, which, you know, if you're going to do a documentary about dance, if you don't have film showing the dance, it's kind of difficult, but I really lucked out. I found two pieces of video. One, I'm going to give another shout out to the New York Public Library, Jerome Robbins Division. Yay. They had archival footage of George appearing on a public TV show. WGBH 1959 had a show called A Time to Dance. And it's one of these half-hour programs that's kind of cute when you look at it today. It's like, this is ballet, this is the first position, the second position.
Hmm.
And the person who kind of organized this show was Andrei Iglevsky. And so in the program, Andre and Maria Tallchief demonstrate a pas de deux. But for the studio portion, Andre had George and Linda Yurth, who actually went on to dance for the New York City Ballet as a principal, demonstrate bar work and demonstrate the Bluebird pas de deux. So we had that footage. And then I also found footage of George in the Flower Drum Song that appeared on the Ed Sullivan Show in 1958, December. And for the benefit of your listeners, you know, when George's ballet career didn't turn the way he wanted it to, when he didn't join the New York City Ballet or American Ballet Theater, you know, he needed to make a living. And so he auditioned for the Flower Drum Song. And he did the Bluebird Pas, by the way, for his audition and kind of blew away all the other jazz dancers who were there. But as he was leaving, the director stopped him at the elevator and said, George, I know you love ballet. I know you want a career in ballet, but I really think you should give Broadway a chance. And the director was Gene Kelly.
I was just going to say, it wasn't just any director.
I know. It was
Incredible.
Gene Kelly. So, yeah, so George was then in the Flower Drum Song. So that's the footage we have of George dancing in the film. We have it from the Flower Drum Song and from this program, A Time to Dance. So without that, you know, it would be really hard to build this story. I forget, Michael, what
Yeah.
your question was. Did I answer it?
I don't remember what it was either. We're
Okay.
just having a good time chatting about
Yeah,
George, you know.
exactly.
Yes.
Uh, but yeah, I mean, the video is so, it definitely helps give us an idea of what made George special. But I think what makes George special as an interview subject is so different. I don't know what it is about him that he's so immediately magnetic. He's just so warm. And then I really and was struck by how he navigated all these difficulties in life, whether it was
Mhm.
something racial or, the tragedy of his father dying or adjusting to life, being a refugee and all these things. He just kind of, it's not like he shrugs them off, but it's just,
He took it all in
he just
stride, it
has
seems like.
so
Exactly.
even keeled. Yeah. And I think that makes him really all the more compelling.
He rolled with the punches,
Hmm.
and he didn't get bitter. Like there's one quote in the film where, I asked him about disappointment at not getting hired by the New York City Ballet. And he said, Balanchine liked his ballerinas tall and leggy. And he said, what am I? I'm a little shrimp. They don't need that. So it's like he rolled with the punches and he just, then turned to Broadway. And when the Flower Drum song took off, I think that kept him employed for like 3 years at least.
Hmm.
He just decided to go that way and to forge a career as a music theater dancer and Broadway. And he had a lot of success and he had a lot of, disappointment that he had to face and challenges. The film is called 10 Times Better because when he and his mother were finally leaving this refugee camp in the Philippines after 2 years of just waiting, the mother told George, she said, listen, you're part Chinese. You're going to America. You want to compete in the world of ballet, and you have to be 10 times better than everyone else because you're Chinese. So that was his white mother telling him. And George said that his entire life he just lived with that in his head, that he needed to be 10
Hmm.
times better to be just as good.
And 10 times better he was. Can you tell the story, if you don't mind, about the double tours when he was on
Yeah.
tour on the Broadway show and
Yes.
his colleagues?
Yes. So how hard is it to do a double tour? I'm not a dancer.
Okay, just for reference, I mean, this is not typical, but for me personally, I remember the day that I did my last double tour on stage and thought, yes, never again.
Really.
So happy. It's the number one thing. Like, I miss so many things about being a performer, and that is absolutely not one of them.
So
Mm.
Gene Kelly didn't choreograph Flower Drum Song. I think it was Carol Haney. But when they realized George could do fabulous double tours, one of the pieces that he was in, it's just filled with double tours, and we feature that in the movie because he performed that on the Ed Sullivan Show, and he would just do double tours repeatedly every single night and never fail to land properly. And so there was one night where he wobbled a little bit and his castmates backstage let out a yelp like he's human. He's not a robot. He does occasionally falter in his double tour. But
And
when
the way
you
he told that story too, he's like, well, that night I was a little tired,
I
but
was a little tired and I just touched the ground with my hand. Um, but yeah, I mean, his double tours that you can see in that clip are just perfect.
Oh,
And he
and
nails
just
the landing every time.
beautiful height. And one thing too is at the end of the film, you guys are filming a reunion
Yes.
this show. And so, and all these people going up to him and being like, George, we never saw anyone jump like you or do double tours like you. And you can feel their warmness and how genuinely they feel that. And I wondered about that reunion. Was that something that just happened to be happening? So you were able to capture it? Tell us a little bit about that too.
It was just total coincidence. I mean, we started filming in February. We went out to Las Vegas twice. And then we heard that there was this reunion luncheon happening in Los Angeles of dancers from the Flower Drum song. Helen Funai Erickson was one of the original dancers. She was 15 when she danced in Flower Drum song,
Wow.
and she was the hostess. Helen and another friend, Mei Wong, and there were about a dozen dancers. And so we decided to film George attending this reunion. The reunion had been delayed because of COVID, so they were finally able to get together. And it was such a delight to see how others reacted to him. So when he walked into this, this room where they were having the luncheon, everyone came up to him. And as you pointed out, Rebecca, people were really, they remember his skill. And also,
Mhm.
this didn't make the film, but what they also remember was his generosity,
Hmm.
and that he wanted everyone around him to be better.
Yeah.
And so he would take them with him. And he, like one dancer said, I remember you used to do your own class before we would go on. And he said, those were so helpful to me. So
Mm.
he shared and he wanted others to look better too. So he worked with them, and he's just a very quiet, humble person. But, the others really remember George as a remarkable dancer.
Yeah. I think it's just it it hit home for me in the way of dancers have two lives, right? So now he retires from dancing and now he goes to learn to be a blackjack dealer in Las Vegas. And the way the movie starts out, I don't think this is a spoiler because it's also in the trailer, is someone's just sitting at his table saying, like, how long have you been doing this? He says, I think 20 years. And they say, well, what did you do before that? And he goes, I was a dancer, just so casually. And it's like, so insane for us to watch as like he was such an important part of history for ballet, specifically with Nutcracker. But then, of course, this whole career is just so interesting. And so, what a touching moment that was.
Yeah, I'm so glad you picked up on that because one of the things that I think about is he's actually been a blackjack dealer for 40 years.
Oh,
So,
okay. 40,
so,
that's insane.
so I
Yeah.
think about literally the tens of thousands of people who would have sat across from him at the blackjack table at the Four Queens Casino in Las Vegas and just thought to themselves, another old guy with an accent, another immigrant.
Mhm.
Nothing to see here. But if they
Mhm.
Totally.
stop and talk to George, you realize this is a person with a significant life story. We started filming this in February, coinciding with our project was the excitement over the movie Everything Everywhere All at Once. And it seemed like, Asian American performers were having a day. They were
Mhm.
finally, taking their place center stage in Hollywood with the all the awards and acclaim that movie was getting. And James Hong, the actor, he was in Everything Everywhere All at Once. I think he's like 94. He was a pioneer in Hollywood. And when I was pitching this project, I said, George is to ballet what someone like James Hong is to Hollywood. He was a pioneer. He was like out there in the 1950s trying to make his way as a dancer. So I really thought it was important to spotlight George and his life story because, you have to know your past if you're going to understand your present and your future. So
Mhm.
I just, there aren't very many Asian dancers from the 1940s, 1950s in ballet. Sono Osato is the one who usually comes to mind. And she was like in the 1940s, she was Japanese American. But I think George, may be the first, featured Asian male dancer for the New York City Ballet. I can't confirm that. We try to. My intern went through every single program at the New York Public Library for the New York City
Wow.
Ballet going back to 1948. We couldn't find anyone, but George was a pioneer, and so it's important for him to get his moment, I think.
Yeah. Being that George is such a humble person, did you have to convince him to to entertain the idea of being the subject of a documentary, or did he come around fairly quickly?
He came around. I mean, he was shocked that I was interested. And then I think he was still a little skeptical when I showed up there with a crew in February. He he brought a friend with him the first time we sat down for an interview, and he later confided that the reason he brought his friend was he still wasn't sure that I wasn't trying to scam him, like that this was an elaborate scam of some sort. So he brought
Hmm.
his friend with him.
Mm.
But the first meeting we had, he showed up with his portfolio. So he had this satchel that was filled with photographs, programs, clippings, some going back to Shanghai when he was a child,
Wow.
and like an article that appeared in the North China Daily, another ad featuring George that was all in Russian. And it occurred to me, like, his mother saved all this, and all of these photographs and all this ephemera has traveled with George from Shanghai to the Philippines to New York to Las Vegas. I mean, it's followed him all over, and he had a trove of old photographs of him as a child in Shanghai, photos of him, when he first got to New York City in the studio. He had a few Nutcracker images and some flower drum pictures. So
Mm.
he had he had chronicled in his life and saved all these important things. So when he finally realized that I wasn't a scam artist, that I truly did want to tell his story, he really just opened up and shared with me. And we went back another time in April, and then we filmed him in May at the reunion. But we really wanted to turn this around quickly. So it's a short documentary. It's only a half hour, but I think it was important for us to showcase this. And George will be at the world premiere, Film at Lincoln Center's Dance on Camera Festival. He'll be there, and he'll get to see
Yay.
his story on the big screen. So we're very excited about that. And Works in Process is also doing an event at the New York Public Library about the making of the film and how I use the archives to visually tell George's story. And George is also going to be there along with the other producers, Corey Steig and John Funabiki. So it's very exciting, everything that's happening.
I feel already like emotional just thinking about it because it's something like this is decades of George not really understanding his own influence and impact, and to have people actually say that to you just goes to show you how, it's it ain't over till it's over, and
Yeah.
he's gonna have this beautiful moment that you're giving him that he's so deserving of, that a little bit more than a year ago he would never have fathomed, and now he's gonna get to have his flowers. It's
So
so beautiful.
beautiful.
Yeah. And, he spent it was a lifetime of him not realizing the contribution he was making in
Mhm.
terms of dance. And so, it's going to be thrilling. With the film, we shared it with some people to get their reaction, and like Edward Villela, says that this is a phenomenal story, and the broadcaster Connie Chung said, George's story is my story. This idea of having
Aw.
to be 10 times better if you're,
Mhm.
a person of color. And David Henry Hwang, who actually remade Flower Drum Song in 2002, he said this is an important story to
Mhm.
showcase because, we're interested in ballet and talking about the Nutcracker, but it's equally important is George's role with the Flower Drum Song. So
Absolutely, yeah.
Flower Drum was really the first time someone of the stature of Rogers and Hammerstein focused their attention on the Asian American experience. It's
Right.
really, a tale about Asian immigrants. And so for Asian American performers back in the 50s, this was like full employment, first of all. And it was just a seminal moment in theater, and George was a part of that also.
Yeah.
It wasn't all easy for him in music theater. He said a lot of times he would go to these cattle calls and be, in the final few, and then he would be told, "Sorry, George, you're not the type." And he says in the film, "Well, what's the type that you're looking for?" Obviously, he was, a talented dancer, but it's a kind of a reflection of the times, I believe, in the 60s. There weren't a lot of opportunities for Asian dancers.
Right.
I mean, just devastating, that part for me. I mean, when he talks about after a show in Houston, I think it was Houston, and he said, I couldn't go eat because it said whites only outside the restaurant. And I mean, it's not that long ago. It
Yeah.
was
Yeah.
so sad. I was
Mhm.
crying. I mean, it's just it's such a moving story. And thank you for sharing it with us. I mean, Michael and I were texting each other like, we're crying. It's so beautiful. But I hope that all of our listeners will get to see it. Can you tell us about the events that are happening in New York, if they are open to some of our listeners, and then maybe where we hope that we might be able to enjoy the film in the future?
Yes. So, Works in Process is having an event at the New York Public Library on February the 7th. And that'll be, a panel discussion, including George, about the making of the film and the creating of the film and how we used archival resources from the library. And then on February the 10th, we'll have our world premiere at Dance on Camera. And so in the year ahead, we've entered a lot of film festivals. So we hope to introduce people to George's story through festivals. And ultimately, we'd like to be on public TV or have some sort of streaming availability. So all this is information to come.
Good. Well, please let us
Great.
know if it does end up on streaming. We will share it with our listeners when that happens because
Great.
we really, really want people to see it because it's just so beautiful. And so people in the New York area, we hope that we'll put some links in the description of the episode so that people can find that information as well for these events.
Thank you. I hope people can see George's story and appreciate it. And I can't wait for him to see it on the big screen.
Yeah, it's going to be so
Me
touching.
too.
Oh.
Thank you so much for joining us today. And thank you for helping George share his story. It's so important.
Well, thank you for having me on the program. It's been an honor.
Thank you.
Conversations on Dance is part of the ACAST Creator Network. For more information, visit conversationsondancepod.com.